Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a time when the air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, the soft flicker of candlelight played across the walls, and the low hum of voices mixed with the clink of goblets in a grand medieval feast hall. The air feels heavy, warm with wood smoke, spiced with the faint trace of cloves, nutmeg, maybe even a hint of cinnamon. As you ease in, your shoes crunch softly against the rush-strewn floor, and already, it's a little overwhelming, the weight of the tapestries draped from the walls, the glint of pearls and ribbons twined through the hair of noble ladies. And at the very heart of it all, an enormous table groaning under the weight of food. Honestly, you probably wouldn't last long here. The sheer heat of the kitchen fires, the chaos, the absence of modern sanitation, it's a different world entirely. And don't even think about table manners. One wrong glance at the wrong person, or using the wrong spoon, and you're as good as banished to the far end of the hall. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Let's make this a little sleepy history community, shall we? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's story together. You stand quietly near the back wall, watching the cooks in a flurry of motion as they scurry past with trays piled high. The table is already covered in dark, crusty rounds of bread, their sour tang curling in the air, and trenchers thick slabs of stale bread, ready to soak up whatever greasy delights the feast might offer. But the real show, that's still backstage. At the far end of the room, beyond a velvet rope, a cluster of servants and cooks huddle in careful concentration around a large platter. You edge closer, stepping over a hound snoozing beneath the table, and finally get a glimpse, the star of the evening. A roasted peacock, skin glistening, golden brown, its wings poised in an elegant arc, and its tail feathers fanned wide like a painter's brush bursting with color. The blues and greens shimmer in the candlelight, catching the eye from every corner of the room. For a split second, it almost looks alive. It isn't, of course, and that's the point. It's all a trick, a little medieval theater disguised as dinner. The lords and ladies will gasp and sigh, impressed by the spectacle. You wonder how the cooks pulled it off. You're not the only one either. Historians still argue whether this was common knowledge in kitchens across Europe or a closely guarded secret held by the most skilled cooks. After all, the process isn't exactly simple. Skinning the bird whole, roasting the meat to perfection, and then redressing it so the skin doesn't tear, the feathers don't burn, and the whole thing holds together under the scrutiny of the entire feast hall. It feels like a magic trick, and maybe, in a way, it is. Yet no one seems to pause for long. The lords at the high table barely glance at the peacock as it's paraded in. They're too busy swapping gossip about taxes, marriages, and who's in or out of favor at court. A few ladies lean in, whispering behind their hands, while the children gawk, wide-eyed and fidgeting in their seats. Meanwhile, the cooks, those invisible hands behind the spectacle, wipe sweat from their brows, exchanging quick, tired glances. You spot a young kitchen boy trying to stifle a grin as he sneaks a glance at the bird being carried in. His expression says it all. Asterisk, that's the best thing we've made all week. Asterisk, but he knows better than to say a word. In this world, cooks are like the rushes on the floor, meant to blend in, to support the feast without drawing attention. The scents that fill the hall are almost dizzying, the savory weight of roasting meats, the sharp vinegar of pickled vegetables, the faint sweetness of honey-glazed pastries waiting patiently for their turn on the table. You breathe it in, and for a moment, it almost makes you forget about the soot drifting in the air, or the occasional rat darting between the floorboards. Peacocks weren't the only birds given this royal treatment, of course. Swans, herons, even cranes were sometimes dressed and reassembled in their feathers, transformed from birds to spectacles. But something about the peacock's iridescent shimmer, its bold blues and greens, made it the undeniable star. You glance toward the high table again, and catch sight of a nobleman absent-mindedly plucking a feather from the peacock's tail, whirling it between his fingers more like a trophy than part of a meal. And honestly, you get it. The feather's the real prize here. The meat, well, that's another story. Some say peacock was tough, stringy, more of a novelty than a culinary delight. Others argue that with the right spices, saffron, cinnamon, a whisper of ginger, the meat could be coaxed into something edible, perhaps even delicious. But as you stand there, half hidden behind a curtain, you can't help but think of the sheer effort behind the spectacle. The catching of the bird, the skinning, the plucking, the roasting over an unpredictable fire, the delicate process of fitting the skin and feathers back in place. The constant worry that one misstep could ruin hours, even days, of work. It's performance as much as it is food. And tomorrow it begins again. The rush is swept out, the platters scrubbed, the kitchen fires lit anew, and the cook's already whispering about the next creation, perhaps a sugar castle, filled with live birds. Or another shimmering peacock, ready to take its place at the heart of the feast. For tonight, though, as the lords sip spiced wine and nibble marzipan fruits, the peacock reigns supreme, a shimmering reminder that in the medieval world, food was never just food. It was theater, status, and spectacle all stitched together in one improbable, glistening bird. The flickering torchlight casts long shadows across the great hall, and you can't help but fixate on that peacock. It's impossible to ignore, isn't it? It's the kind of thing that draws your gaze whether you want it to or not, those glossy feathers gleaming like little pools of oil, the intricate blues and greens catching the light just so. The cooks, with a subtle bow, lower the platter onto the table, right in front of the high-ranking lords and ladies who barely pause their conversation. You'd think a bird like that would deserve a moment of silence, but no, life goes on. The only real sign of interest is a lazy wave from a nobleman who leans in and says something to the man next to him. Probably a joke about how much the thing must have cost, because let's be honest, this isn't about hunger. This is about making a statement. You watch as a carver steps forward. Yes, there's an official carver for this kind of thing, and begins the slow, almost ceremonial process of slicing into the peacock. The knife glides through the skin, still gleaming with its original color, and reveals the dark, glistening meat underneath. You can almost smell the juices as they drip onto the platter, mixing with herbs and bits of gold leaf scattered on the surface. That's right, gold leaf, because in this world, why not eat a little treasure with your dinner? It's not like it'll do much for your digestion, but it sure makes you look fancy. And as the meat is portioned out, you can't help but think of the sheer absurdity of the whole thing. The guests barely nibble at the bird, each taking a small, polite piece, as if to say, yes, I appreciate the effort, but let's not get carried away. It's almost as if the bird is there to be admired, not eaten. Which, to be fair, is pretty much the point. The peacock, resplendent and theatrical, is more of a conversation starter than a meal. It's like serving a Fabergé egg at your dinner party, not because you expect anyone to actually eat it, but because you can. Of course, the cooks know this too. They're not expecting compliments on flavor, not really. They're hoping for gasps when the bird is revealed, maybe a round of applause if they're lucky, and at the very least, a nod of approval from the master of the house. That's their currency. And in the kitchen, there's a kind of quiet competition whose peacock gets the loudest reaction, whose display lasts the longest without sagging under its own weight. It's a tough job, and honestly, you're not sure you'd survive a day in their shoes. The heat alone is enough to make you swoon, and that's before you get into the whole business of handling raw birds for hours on end. You glance at the other platters lining the table. There are pies with intricate pastry designs, fish arranged in patterns that look like scales, and towers of sweetmeats stacked so high they wobble every time someone passes too closely. But none of them have quite the same impact as that peacock. It's the undisputed centerpiece, the showstopper. And it's not just about the feathers, either, though those certainly help. It's about what the peacock represents: wealth, power, and the ability to command an army of cooks to create a spectacle just because you can. Historians still argue whether the peacock's role was more symbolic or culinary. Was it a delicacy that people genuinely enjoyed eating, or was it more of a medieval flex, a way of saying, look how much I can afford to waste? The accounts vary. Some medieval sources rave about the flavor: tough but rich, gamey but satisfying. Others, with a little more honesty perhaps, admit that the meat was often stringy and dry, best smothered in sauce or hidden under layers of other flavors. And let's not forget the hazards of the open-fire kitchen. More than one peacock likely emerged from the flames a little more charred than intended, which might explain why diners were less eager to tuck in. As you take it all in, you spot a little detail that makes you smile. A child, perhaps the daughter of a wealthy merchant, sneaks a finger towards the peacock's tail feathers when no one's looking. She strokes the soft plumes, her eyes wide, completely mesmerized. For a moment, you imagine the bird alive, strutting through the feast hall as if it owns the place, its long tail dragging across the floor, scattering crumbs in its wake. Of course, it's not alive. It's been skinned, roasted, and reassembled with the same level of care you might use to wrap a priceless vase in tissue paper. But still, the illusion holds. For a few minutes, everyone pretends, just a little. Meanwhile, the cooks linger at the edges, watching with quiet pride. They know the risks, the heat, the sharp knives, the chance that a stray spark could send the feathers up in smoke. They've heard the stories of kitchens catching fire, of birds falling apart mid-feast, of guests recoiling in horror at the smell of burnt feathers. And yet, here they are, delivering the perfect peacock, a gleaming monument to skill and patience. As the evening wears on, the focus shifts. More dishes arrive, platters of roast beef, trenchers piled with cheese, bowls of spiced fruit, and the peacock, once the star, slowly fades into the background. A few guests pick at the meat, but most seem content to admire it from afar, as if afraid to ruin the artistry. And in a way, that's fitting. The peacock was never meant to be eaten so much as admired, like a jewel set on a plate. Eventually, a servant leans in to clear the platter. The feathers, still mostly intact, flutter slightly as they're lifted away, and you feel a pang of something, maybe awe, maybe sadness. It's a fleeting moment of beauty in a world that often seems so brutal. And as the peacock disappears behind the kitchen doors, you wonder, was it worth all the effort? The cooks seem to think so. And honestly, watching the guests' faces light up for even a second, you can't help but agree. The kitchen door swings shut behind the peacock, and you trail behind it in your imagination, weaving your way through the labyrinth of the medieval kitchen. The air thickens, almost immediately warm, smoky, and heavy with the scent of meat and fat. You dodge a scullion carrying a dripping ladle of something brown and bubbling, and just beyond, there's the cook who handled that magnificent peacock, sleeves rolled up, arms slick with grease. You watch as he reaches for the skin, a peacock's entire, delicate, jewel-toned skin now carefully draped over a wooden rack like a particularly fancy dish towel. This is the art of peacock skinning, and it's every bit as fiddly as it sounds. The trick is to separate the skin from the bird in one piece, feathers, tail, neck, and all without tearing it. Imagine it, one wrong tug, and you've got a bald patch right on the crown of your table's centerpiece. Not exactly the look you're going for when trying to impress the Duke of somewhere important. The cook leans in, eyes narrowed in concentration, as he tugs at a stubborn patch near the wing. He's using a small, curved blade sharp as a whisper and a wooden-handled spoon to gently ease the skin away from the meat. The skin comes off slowly, a little like peeling a ripe peach, except this peach has talons and a beak and a tail that could double as a feather duster for a cathedral. You wonder who first thought of doing this, who looked at a peacock and thought, yes, I'll cook it, but I'd really like to keep the feathers intact for the presentation. Historians still argue whether this was a practice born out of pure showmanship or whether it had deeper symbolic roots. Was it just culinary theater, or was the peacock's beauty meant to convey a message about the host's power over nature, life, and death itself? After all, it's a strange kind of magic, this bird, skinned and roasted, only to be stitched back into its own feathers, a strange culinary phoenix of sorts. Once the meat has been roasted golden, crisp, maybe a little overdone around the edges, there's the tricky bit, draping the skin back over the body so that it looks natural. Like the bird is merely napping, albeit a little flatter and a little more, well, roasted. You watch as the cook's apprentice, a freckled boy with a nervous expression, starts the careful process of reassembly. He lifts the skin like a fragile tapestry, laying it gently over the roasted bird. The feathers settle back into place like they never left, though a few quills stick out at odd angles. A quick adjustment, a press of the hand, and the illusion is almost perfect. The neck, long and arching, is restuffed with cotton and wire, so it holds its stately curve. A dab of honey mixed with saffron is brushed across the beak to give it a glossy sheen, because why not add a little edible glam while you're at it? And then, of course, the crowning touch, the tail feathers, fanned out behind like a halo. The cook squints, leans in, and yes, there it is, a single rogue feather is gently twisted back into line. You can't help but smile. It's part meticulous craftsmanship, part pure stubborn pride. The kitchen bustles around them, a chaotic orchestra of clanging pots, hissing fires, and shouted instructions. Yet in this corner, there's a hush, a little bubble of quiet around the peacock as it comes back to life, feather by feather. And while the cooks focus on their bird, you catch snatches of conversation drifting from the other side of the room, a debate about whether cinnamon is too costly to use on rabbit stew. A story about the last time a boar got loose in the pantry. Apparently, it wasn't pretty. And an apprentice bragging that he can pluck a goose in under 5 minutes, though no one seems particularly impressed. You learn a quirky detail in passing. Some cooks, to make the illusion even more convincing, would actually reattach the peacock's head using a little iron spike, so it could sit proudly atop the body, beak slightly open as if mid-song. It's a little unsettling, you have to admit, like taxidermy meets dinner, but it's all part of the show. The meat itself, once all the artistry is stripped away, is honestly less exciting. A little tough, a little dry. Historians still argue whether the skinning and reassembly process left the meat overcooked by the time it reached the table. Some say yes, others argue that clever cooks knew to under-roast the bird before its feathered costume went back on, allowing it to finish gently in the warming trays of the feast hall. There's no consensus, just as there's no clear answer to how many peacocks were actually served in a year. Records are spotty at best, and let's face it, medieval cooks didn't always have time to write down their best tricks for posterity. And yet, here you are, watching a moment that feels both timeless and deeply human. The pressure to impress, the desire to make something beautiful, the quiet pride in a job well done, it's all there in the careful way the cook smooths down the peacock's neck feathers. Then steps back, eyes narrowed, hands on hips, to survey the final product. And as the bird is lifted onto the platter, ready for its grand reentrance, you realize, this isn't just dinner. It's performance art. It's a little absurd, a little magical, and very, very medieval. The smell of roasted meat and spices lingers in the air like a warm fog, thick and comforting in a way that makes you feel both hungry and a little dizzy. The cooks have just stepped back, their masterpiece peacock ready for display, and the scent of it wafts out across the hall, mingling with other smells: sweet honey, tangy vinegar, the sharp kick of cloves and pepper. You wrinkle your nose as a whiff of something slightly burnt drifts in from a corner, but no one else seems to notice. They're too busy admiring the spectacle of the peacock, feathers gleaming like gemstones. It's not just about the peacock, though. All around, the feast is a riot of colors and aromas, a kind of edible fireworks display. You pause by a long table covered in dishes you can barely name, what looks like a bright green pudding, a pie crust sculpted into the shape of a castle, and something that might be a fish but is so heavily glazed and dusted with sugar it's hard to tell. There's an art to it. You realize this isn't just cooking, it's performance. And nowhere is that clearer than in the use of spices. Spices, in the medieval world, are as much about showing off as they are about flavor. You've got saffron turning rice into a glowing gold pile, cloves sticking out of hams like tiny dark jewels, and cinnamon dusted over roasted apples so heavily they look like they've been dipped in sand. You lean in, breathing deeply, and the scent of nutmeg nearly makes your eyes water. That's not just because they like the taste. Mind you, it's because nutmeg, like many imported spices, was staggeringly expensive. Historians still debate just how much of the spice craze was driven by actual flavor preference and how much was about the social flex. After all, a lord serving a peacock dusted in saffron isn't just saying, "Enjoy your meal." He's saying, "I have enough money to paint my food gold." It's the medieval equivalent of driving a Rolls-Royce through a grocery store parking lot. And if you think saffron is over the top, just wait. You spot a servant carrying a plate where the entire dish is covered, yes, covered in edible gold leaf. You wonder if it tastes like anything at all or if it's just crunchy metal flakes getting stuck in the back of your teeth. But no one seems to mind. The ladies at the high table lean in, eyes wide, their gazes sparkling with delight. One of them claps softly, as if the cook has just pulled a rabbit out of a hat, which, in a way, he has. Nearby, two men murmur in low voices. One, speaking in the kind of grand, self-important tone that demands attention, announces that the cinnamon sprinkled over the pudding came all the way from Ceylon. His companion nods, though it's clear he hasn't the faintest idea where Ceylon actually is. He just knows it sounds impressively far and expensive. And that's the whole point, isn't it? It's not about the taste. It's about the performance, the idea that the host can afford ingredients that cost more than a year's wages for a field hand. There's a rumor drifting through the hall, too, something about a pie served at another feast, stuffed with live birds, larks, or sparrows perhaps. That burst out in a flutter of feathers when the crust was cut. The thought makes you smile, though you wonder whether it's a real recipe or just a bit of medieval gossip, a culinary legend that's grown in the retelling. Either way, the guests seem to relish the tale as much as they would the dish itself. And then there's the color. You catch sight of a platter where the meat has been dyed a striking shade of blue, yes, blue, and hear someone muttering that it's been tinted with ground lapis lazuli. That seems a touch extravagant, doesn't it? Crushing precious gemstones just to tint your dinner. But again, that's the point. If you can afford to sprinkle powdered lapis over your meal, you're not just eating, you're making a statement that you've arrived. The cooks understand this game. They play it well, balancing on the knife's edge of artistry and absurdity. You overhear a weary kitchen maid, her apron dusted with flour and streaked with sweat, complaining under her breath that she spent half the morning arranging cloves into a checkerboard pattern on a row. Asked only for the Lord to declare he wasn't in the mood for cloves that day. Hours of work, dismissed with a flick of a hand. And yet, despite it all, there's a quiet pride in the kitchen. The head cook, broad-shouldered, arms like hams, voice rough as gravel, watches the dishes leave the kitchen, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. He knows he's not just sending out food. He's creating a moment, a memory, a story that the guests will carry with them long after the candles have guttered out. You drift back into the main hall, where the sounds of the feast still hum, the clink of goblets, the low drone of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter. And in the center of it all, that peacock glows in the candlelight, its feathers shimmering like an oil painting come to life, its skin glossy and golden. It's absurd, really an elaborate, impractical, stunningly beautiful thing. You pause, taking it all in, and for a fleeting moment, you think maybe the food isn't meant to taste good at all. Maybe it's just meant to remind you that you're here, that you've made it through another day, that the world, strange, brutal, ridiculous as it may be, can still hold a little magic now and then. And with that thought lingering, you step back into the shadows, content to watch the spectacle unfold. The peacock remains the crown jewel of the feast, but it's not for everyone. You linger near the far end of the table, watching how the platters move like pieces in a slow, deliberate game of culinary chess. The lords at the high table get the best portions, the plumpest breast meat, the richest cuts near the thigh, a wing here or there if they fancy it. Farther down the table, the lesser guests receive whatever scraps are left if they get anything at all. You spot a young page hovering at the back, wide-eyed and hopeful, craning his neck for a glimpse of the peacock. His lips move in a silent prayer, perhaps for a scrap of meat to find its way to his plate, perhaps just for the chance to see the bird up close. But the truth is, he likely won't get a bite. Peacocks, for all their dazzling plumage, aren't exactly generous portions once the feathers and bones are accounted for. They're not served for the sake of hunger, they're served for the highborn, the honored guests, the ones whose social rank is measured not just by their titles, but by what they're seen eating. That's the heart of it, isn't it? This feast isn't really about eating. It's a performance, a ritual, a statement. The peacock on the platter is a symbol of power, of wealth, of the host's ability to summon rare birds from distant lands, dress them in shimmering glory, and present them in the smoky, chaotic glow of a feast hall. It's the edible equivalent of a crown. You catch the glint of the peacock's feathers in the firelight, the soft blues, the subtle greens, and as you lean closer, you spot a detail, a small blackened patch near the wing. A reminder that even the most carefully orchestrated show can have its imperfections. It makes you smile. Even in this polished display, the kitchen fires don't always behave. The lords at the high table don't seem to notice. They chatter on, tearing pieces of bread, sipping spiced wine, dabbing their mouths with linen napkins. One of them absently picks at the peacock's wing with a jeweled knife, examines the meat as though inspecting a rare gemstone, then offers it to the lady beside him, who accepts it with a polite nod only to leave it untouched on her plate. Was the meat tender? Was it flavorful? Did it carry that deep, gamey richness some sources claim, or was it, as others argue, more like an overcooked turkey, stringy, dry, and only bearable when drenched in sauce. Historians still debate whether medieval diners genuinely liked the taste of peacock or if they merely pretended to enjoy it as part of the ritual. After all, no one wants to be the person who grimaces at a dish that's taken 3 days to prepare. You imagine the awkward shuffle of a noble trying to hide a grimace behind a goblet of wine. Delicious, they'd mumble, pushing the meat to the side. You also wonder about the cooks, the unsung heroes hidden behind the scenes, working in stifling heat, sweating over open fires, desperately trying to create something both edible and impressive. Did they taste their creations? Did they know the peacock wasn't exactly a flavor sensation, but shrugged and thought, it's not about that, it's the feathers, the show? Or were there moments when a cook, quietly in a corner, sampled a bit of peacock and thought, actually, this isn't half bad? And what about the diners at the far end of the table, the ones who never even got close to the peacock? You watch a merchant's wife nibbling on a small piece of pork, her eyes flickering longingly toward the high table. A clerk seated next to her sighs and stares at his trencher, where a few shriveled vegetables and a hunk of bread are all that remain. The peacock is out of reach, both literally and socially. It's a subtle kind of hierarchy, this division of food, and you see it everywhere. The lord's plate is full of rare treats, imported figs, candied ginger, little tarts shaped like stars. The steward's plate has fewer choices, but still respectable. The apprentice's plate, mostly bread. The kitchen boy's, if he's lucky, a few scraps once the feast is over. And yet, they all play their part in this strange dance of status and spectacle. You glance back at the peacock, now half-carved, its feathers still gleaming in the low light. A servant adjusts the tail, fluffing it slightly to keep the illusion alive. Another guest reaches for a piece, hesitates, and opts instead for a safer choice, the slice of roast beef, dripping with gravy. It's almost as if no one really wants to eat the peacock, but no one wants to admit it either. The cooks, watching from the kitchen door, exchange glances. One of them, a weary man with a crooked grin, mutters under his breath, and you imagine him saying something like, "All that work, and they barely touch it." His companion smirks, shrugs, and wipes his hands on his apron, as if to say, "That's just how it goes." And so it does. The peacock glistens, admired but largely untouched, a symbol of status more than sustenance. And as the evening stretches on, you realize, in this world, it's not what you eat that matters, it's what you're seen eating. And whether you know how to act like you belong at the table where the peacock sits. The hall's warmth clings to you like a heavy cloak, the mingled scents of roasted meat, honey, and burnt bread swirling in the air. The peacock, once the centerpiece of the table, now lies partially carved, its skin slipping in places, feathers slightly askew, a small pool of juices glistening on the platter beneath. But the cooks aren't done with it yet. You watch as a kitchen boy, hardly more than a child, approaches with a wide-eyed expression and a tray piled high with herbs, thyme, rosemary, parsley, and unexpectedly mint. The cook lifts a brow, considers for a moment, then begins stuffing the peacock's body with the fragrant greens, tucking them in like bedding around a sleeping bird. This isn't for flavor, you realize, or at least not entirely. The herbs are there to mask any less than fresh smells, to suggest freshness even when the bird itself might be, well, less than ideal. Some cooks, you overhear, even sprinkle crushed rose petals or lavender into the cavity, a little floral flair to make the whole thing feel more exotic. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or just something reserved for the most lavish feasts, but either way, it's all part of the peacock's transformation from humble bird to feathered fantasy. And then there's the stuffing, oh yes, the stuffing. You peek over a servant's shoulder and catch a glimpse of what's going inside, a mixture of breadcrumbs, raisins, finely minced meat. Perhaps it's beef or veal, spiced with cinnamon and cloves, all bound together with a splash of wine. It's an odd choice, isn't it? Stuffing a peacock with beef. But here, in this world, the more unexpected the combination, the better. Some cooks go even further, layering birds within birds like a medieval culinary puzzle, tiny songbirds packed into a chicken, the chicken packed into a goose, the goose stuck neatly inside a pig. It's the edible version of a Matryoshka doll, both impressive and faintly ridiculous. You watch as the cook gently pats down the peacock's skin, smoothing it over the bulging stuffing, careful not to tear the delicate skin. The kitchen boy beside him whispers something too low to catch, but it draws a quiet chuckle from the cook. Maybe it's a joke about the absurdity of this whole process, or maybe it's just a shared sigh of relief that, at least for now, the feathers haven't caught fire. Then there's a sudden shift in the kitchen, a small shout, a flash of movement at the far end. An apprentice waves a cloth frantically at a small flare-up near the hearth. A pot of stew has bubbled over, sending a hiss of liquid onto the fire, and for a brief, chaotic moment, the whole kitchen seems to tilt into mayhem. Cooks barking orders, hellions scrambling. A platter of sweetmeats teetering dangerously close to the floor. The tension thrums in the air, a hum of barely controlled chaos pulsing beneath the polished surface of the feast. And yet, through it all, the peacock remains the focus. Amid the clatter and shouts, the cooks return to it like artists to their canvas, ranging herbs just so, adjusting the wings for the most striking angle, tilting the head for maximum drama. There's another curious detail. You notice a quiet little trick tucked into the process. In some kitchens, it seems, the feathers are soaked in a solution of vinegar and saffron, then dried carefully over a low fire to deepen the blues, to make the greens shimmer even more brightly. A tiny touch of chemistry in the middle of the kitchen heat. Did it work? Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or the secret weapon of only the most elite cooks. Either way, it's the kind of detail that makes you pause. How much effort, all for a bird most guests might not even taste. You glance toward the hall, where the peacock is braided in once more. There's polite applause, a few soft exclamations though, how magnificent, but already, attention drifts elsewhere. The novelty fades so quickly, doesn't it? One moment the peacock is the star of the show, and the next, it's just another dish among dozens, slowly cooling on the table. Still, the cooks press on. They keep crafting, keep pushing the limits, keep finding new ways to astonish. It's funny, in a way the bird itself may be dry, the spices perhaps a little too heavy, the stuffing a strange choice, but none of that seems to matter. What matters is that, for a fleeting, shining moment, the peacock seemed poised to take flight right there on the table. And as the hall settles into a quieter rhythm, the fires die down, and the kitchen hums back into its steady, smoky cadence, you can't help but marvel at the sheer absurdity of it all. The work, the craftsmanship, the performance, and the delicate, fleeting beauty of a bird that was never meant to soar, at least, not like this. The peacock, shimmering and otherworldly in the candlelight, might be the centerpiece of the feast, but to really understand its place in the medieval world, you have to take a step back now. Farther than that, and consider what it truly represents. This isn't just dinner. It's a symbol, a statement. It's about power. Status. Thin spoken language that says, look at what I can afford, at what my wealth and influence can summon. You hover at the edge of the hall, taking it all in as the lords and ladies murmur to one another, their voices weaving through the air like lazy threads of smoke. A nobleman in a deep red velvet tunic gestures toward the peacock with a smirk that says it all, that's mine. I paid for that. My household produced it. My cook created it. My wealth made it happen. It's not quite a boast. Well, all right. It is a boast, but it's delivered with the kind of understated, passive-aggressive polish that only a medieval lord could manage. After all, in this world, you don't tell people you're powerful. You show them. Preferably with a roasted bird, resplendent in its own feathers, laid out like a crown on a platter. And the peacock, it carries its own weight and meaning. To some, it's a symbol of vanity, a bird so dazzling, so self-absorbed, it seems to exist solely to be admired. To others, it's a symbol of immortality. There's an old belief that the flesh of a peacock doesn't decay. Is it true? Almost certainly not. Historians still debate whether this was a widespread belief or simply one of those medieval myths that grew taller in the telling. But the idea lingers, doesn't it? That by serving a peacock at your table, you aren't just offering food, you're offering a little piece of eternity. And let's not forget the visual impact. You stand there, gazing at the tail feathers fanned out behind the bird, shimmering like a jewel-toned halo, and you realize that this is medieval social media. The peacock is a post, a statement, a look-at-me moment that will be gossiped about long after the last candle burns low. And just like modern influencers carefully curating their feeds, the medieval host is curating their feast, choosing which dishes to serve, which spices to flaunt, which spectacles to unveil. "There's a story you overhear," whispered by a merchant's wife to her neighbor. Apparently, at a feast in Burgundy, a lord once served not just a peacock, but an entire menagerie of birds, each more exotic than the last. Swans, cranes, herons, even a pelican brought in, roasted, and presented in all their feathery glory. The guests were stunned. The host was lauded as a man of unparalleled taste and wealth, and for weeks afterward, the talk of the town wasn't taxes or trade agreements, it was birds. Lots and lots of birds. You can't help but think of the poor cooks tasked with preparing that feast. The logistics alone boggle the mind. Where did they get the birds? How did they keep them fresh? Did they argue over who had to pluck the pelican? There's a sense of quiet camaraderie among the kitchen staff, a shared understanding that their job isn't just to feed people, it's to create a spectacle, even if it means a few singed feathers along the way. One of the cooks, an older woman with a flour-dusted apron and sharp eyes, leans against the wall and mutters something to a younger boy bustling past. You catch the words, "all for show and he'll never touch it." She's right, of course. The lord at the high table picks at the peacock's wing, then sets it down, more interested in a goblet of spiced wine than in the bird that's taken 3 days to prepare. And yet, no one seems to mind. The peacock has done its job. It's impressed, dazzled, made people whisper. Whether anyone actually eats it, that's almost beside the point. The cook wipes her hands on her apron, straightens a stray feather, and moves on to the next task: a pile of pears waiting to be poached, a pot of spiced wine that needs tending, a roast that's starting to smoke a little too aggressively in the hearth. You notice, too, how the peacock isn't just a culinary star, it's also a social tool. The host uses it to curry favor, to impress visiting nobles, to signal alliances. Who gets offered the first slice? Whose goblet is refilled first? These are the subtle cues that tell everyone where they stand in the pecking order, pun fully intended. And the cooks, though unseen, are part of that game, too, helping their lord maintain status, secure influence, and maybe, just maybe, avoid being the subject of next week's gossip when someone else throws a better feast. So you stand there, surrounded by the hum of conversation and the clatter of serving platters, and you realize that the peacock isn't just a bird, it's a symbol, a statement, a shimmering, feathered piece of medieval theater. And while it might not taste great, historians still debate that. After all, it's done its job. The guests are talking. The host is glowing. The cooks, despite their exhaustion, exchange small, satisfied smiles. And you're just along for the ride, watching history unfold one shimmering feather at a time. The air in the hall feels heavy now, dense with the lingering scent of roasted meats, wax from the slowly guttering candles, and the faintest hint of trampled herbs from the rushes underfoot. You can feel the collective attention drifting away from the peacock, like a party guest who dazzled upon arrival but now sits awkwardly in the corner, feathers still gleaming but largely ignored. And yet, even as the guests shift their focus to other dishes, the peacock remains a subject of quiet fascination. You find yourself eavesdropping on a pair of older gentlemen seated near the high table. One, a man with a salt-and-pepper beard and the sort of voice that makes everything sound like a lecture, leans in conspiratorially and says, "You know, of course, that no one really likes the taste of peacock." His companion snorts softly, swirling his wine. "Yes, well, it's all for show, isn't it? You almost nod along." That's the unspoken secret hanging over the table, whether anyone actually enjoys the taste of this majestic bird. The records are fuzzy, the source is contradictory. Some accounts describe the peacock's flesh as tough and stringy, best left to the dogs, while others insist it was a prized delicacy, to be savored slowly, preferably with a splash of spiced wine and a good deal of conversation. Historians still argue whether peacocks were genuinely enjoyed as food or simply tolerated for the sake of spectacle. After all, it's hard to separate the legend from the reality when the peacock on the table is as much a social symbol as a dish. One theory you overhear, half whispered by a kitchen maid passing by, is that the best bits of the peacock, the juiciest, most flavorful morsels, weren't even served to the guests at all. Instead, they were quietly saved for the lord's private table, or perhaps spirited away by the cooks themselves after the feast, a little reward for a job well done. It's an intriguing thought, isn't it? That the show was for the guests, but the pleasure was for the cooks. And then there are the whispers, half-believed tales that make you smile in spite of yourself. Some say that eating peacock could bring good luck, that it had mystical properties, or that its meat was so tough and indestructible it could last for days without spoiling. A merchant's wife leans in to tell her neighbor that once, at a feast in Flanders, a peacock was served that had been roasted 3 days earlier, yet still gleamed under the candlelight as if it had just emerged from the flames. "It's the feathers, you see," she says, tapping her nose wisely. "They preserve the magic." You're not sure if you believe that, but it's a good story. And in a way, that's the point, isn't it? The peacock isn't just food, it's a story, a spectacle, a symbol of opulence and power that lingers in the memory long after the plates are cleared. Back in the kitchen, you catch sight of the head cook wiping his hands on a cloth, his face flushed and shining from the heat. He leans against a table for a moment, catching his breath, and you can almost hear his unspoken thoughts. Was it good enough? Did they notice the saffron? Was the skin smooth enough? The feathers bright enough? The stuffing moist enough? The apprentices hover nearby, sharing stories of past peacocks, one that collapsed mid-feast when the wire in its neck snapped, another that burst into flame when a careless cook got too close with a candle, and that one time the lord's hunting dog leapt onto the table and dragged the peacock straight into the rushes, sending feathers flying like confetti. They laugh quietly, their eyes gleaming with the memory, but you can hear the tension beneath it. Every feast is a gamble, every dish a chance for disaster, and the peacock, the prized, precarious centerpiece, is the biggest risk of all. And yet, they do it. Time after time, feast after feast, they roast the birds, redress the skins, range the feathers just so. Whether the guests actually enjoy the taste or not seems almost irrelevant. It's about the performance, the spectacle, the moment when a shimmering, impossible bird is paraded into the hall and everyone gasps in appreciation. You glance back at the peacock on the table, its tail still fanned, though slightly wilted now, and you think, maybe it's a little like those stories the cooks tell. A mixture of fact and fiction, beauty and absurdity, all served up on a platter. And as the guests sip their wine and nibble on spiced fruits, the peacock quietly waits, a glistening, feathered reminder that sometimes, in the grand theater of life, it's not about the taste, it's about the tale you'll tell later, and a quiet moment by the fire, when the candles burn low and the world feels soft and far away. The laughter bubbles over like wine in a goblet, spilling across the hall in waves. Yet behind the scenes in the kitchen, there's a different energy, a restless hum of nervous feet, clattering platters, and hurried whispers. You drift toward the hearth, where the cooks, flushed and glistening with sweat, are catching their breath between courses. And then chaos. A shout rings out, sharp and panicked. You turn, just in time to see a tray slip from a boy's hands, clattering to the floor with a horrible crash. A plate of sugared almonds skitters under a table, and the boy freezes, eyes wide, cheeks flushed with terror. The cook's voice booms across the room, low and gruff like a storm about to break. The boy stammers an apology, bowing so low his nose nearly brushes the rushes. You hold your breath, waiting for a sharp cuff across the ear, but it never comes. The cook glares, mutters something about green apprentices, and waves him off. The tension eases, but just for a moment, because then another shout. This time, it's the scent that hits you first, that sharp, acrid tang of burning feathers. You spin around, eyes wide, and there it is, the peacock. Not the main one, thank goodness, but a backup bird, still in the kitchen, perched precariously near the fire, a single feather at the tip of the tail catching a spark and curling into smoke. The apprentice from earlier scrambles toward it, flapping a cloth wildly, but not before a few feathers blacken and drift lazily to the floor like charred snowflakes. The cook barks orders to get it out. Watch the feathers, and a scullion dashes in with a damp cloth, smothering the tiny flames before they spread. You can practically hear the collective exhale, the kitchen pausing, just for a heartbeat, as if everyone silently agrees that was a close one. Despite the tension, a smile tugs at your lips. It's hard not to find the moment a little ridiculous. This bird, meticulously prepared, treated like treasure, obsessively arranged, and yet all it takes is one flying ember or a clumsy elbow, and poof, it's gone, just like that. The cooks know this reality better than anyone. You catch drifting snippets of their stories, like how last year's feast ended with a sugar tower collapsing in spectacular, sticky fashion. Or the time the Lord's prize swan took a nosedive right into a guest's lap. And no one knew whether to scream or applaud. One tale involves a roast boar catching fire so dramatically that the guests assumed it was part of the entertainment. There's a tired, wry pride woven through these memories, a kind of grizzled camaraderie born from knowing that no matter how carefully you plan, some part of the evening will always teeter on the edge of disaster. Historians still debate whether these kitchen catastrophes were rare flukes or simply part of the norm in the unpredictable world of medieval feasting. After all, when you're juggling open flames, precariously balanced platters, and ingredients that can turn sour without warning, a little chaos isn't just expected, it's guaranteed. And you can't help but think of the cooks themselves, faces flushed, hair damp with sweat, probably half-starved from snatching cold scraps when no one's looking. They're the invisible architects behind the grandeur, the ones who pull off small miracles in conditions that most modern kitchens would consider unthinkable. You catch sight of the head cook again. He's wiping his brow, muttering something about the feather flare-up, but there's a flicker of amusement in his eye, a knowing glint that says, asterisk. Behind every perfect peacock on the table are 5 others that almost went up in flames. Asterisk. But the feast goes on. The guests don't see the close calls, the singed feathers, the anxious apprentices. They see only the bird, gleaming and grand, fanned out like a painting come to life, an image of perfection. It's a little like life, really. From the dining hall, you see the stage, the lights, the flawless presentation. But from the kitchen, you see the mess, the sweat, the near misses and quick recoveries. And somehow, both versions are equally true. As the noise quiets and the flames settle, the peacock, patched, fluffed, and turned so its charred side faces discreetly away, makes its slow, dignified return to the hall. The guests applaud politely, raising goblets in unison, none the wiser. Back in the kitchen, the cooks share quiet glances and the smallest of nods. No one says it out loud, but you can feel it. Asterisk. We pulled it off. Asterisk. Even if just barely. You breathe in the warm, smoky air and smile again. It's chaotic, yes, imperfect, maybe even ridiculous, but it's also oddly beautiful, like a well-rehearsed play that nearly falls apart backstage, yet somehow dazzles under the lights. The kitchen remains thick with heat, wrapping around you like a heavy cloak as the cooks slip back into their rhythm. Their faces are slick with sweat, sleeves rolled, movements practiced from years of repetition. You catch a shared look between 2 of them, a silent exchange, just a quirk of the eyebrow that says asterisk. Same madness, different night. Asterisk. This isn't their first long evening, and it definitely won't be their last. You step closer to the threshold of the kitchen, where the battered wooden door creaks on its hinges, swinging open and shut as apprentices bustle through. It's a constant cycle, trays of roasted meat, pitchers of wine, delicate sweetmeats, all traveling out into the great hall like emissaries. Through that doorway, you glimpse the pulse of it all, the unrelenting rhythm of a cook's life. Imagine slipping into those shoes, the ache in your feet from hours on stone floors, the tug of a flour-caked apron around your waist, the sting of wood smoke in your eyes. It's always hot, your skin slick with grease, arms mottled with the tiny burns that come from too many hours spent too close to the flame, and no time to slow down. The cook's day begins long before the sun even thinks of rising. In the pre-dawn dark, boots thud on cold stone, sleep clings to your eyes, and the frost in the air bites your fingers as you light the first fire. There's bread to be kneaded, a stock pot that mustn't be left to bubble over. The scullions are already hard at work, scrubbing pans with raw, burned hands. Someone's muttering about the state of the thyme. Someone else is grinding a knife that looks like it's seen more winters than the kitchen boy holding it. It's a dance never graceful, never quite synchronized, but somehow it works. Chop, stir, roast, repeat. You move from task to task like a tightrope walker, balancing carefully, hoping the next step won't send something clattering to the floor. One moment you're tending the spit, the next you're rescuing a sagging pear tart. You sigh, press the crust gently back into shape, and turn your focus to the sauce before it boils over. Voices rise around you, sharp and tired. Watch that pot, lad, burn those almonds again and you'll be eating gruel for a week, grumbles the older cook, his voice rough with experience. The boy nods so fast his cap slips sideways, hands trembling as he steadies the pot. You know that look, the hope that your hands remember what your nerves are starting to forget. That tense, anxious pride of knowing a single mistake could unravel hours of careful work. This is the rhythm of the kitchen. Fire, flour, feathers, and sweat woven together to create a fleeting illusion of effortless grandeur. All of it starts here, in the heat, in the noise, and the urgency of a place that never truly rests. And there's the peacock, looming like a silent, feathery sentinel in the background. You remember when it first arrived in the kitchen, plucked and pale, its feathers tucked carefully into a basket nearby. The cook ran his hands over the skin, inspecting for tears, bruises, any flaw that could spoil the final show. The bird was weighed, sniffed, judged. The feathers laid out neatly on a cloth, counted like coins, each one waiting to be placed with care. It's strange, isn't it? All this effort, all this fuss for a bird that most guests won't even taste. The Lord will get the best slice, a few favored nobles might receive a sliver, and the rest. They'll scrape at their trenchers, maybe sip a little broth, or nibble a crust of bread, if they're lucky. You catch a quiet debate nearby this time. It's about the saffron. A younger cook insists it's worth the cost, that the color and richness are part of the spectacle the guests expect. The older cook wipes his hands on his apron, shrugs, and mutters, it's not the color that fills the belly. Historians still puzzle over whether medieval cooks thought of themselves as artists or as practical craftsmen. Some argue they were focused on stretching ingredients, pleasing their lords, and keeping the household fed. Others suggest they took real pride in creating edible wonders, birds that looked ready to take flight, pies that seemed to sing, sugar sculptures that defied gravity. You look around and see both sides at once. The exhaustion is real, so is the quiet pride. The cooks grumble, they laugh, they complain, but when the peacock is finally carried out, when the guests gasp and the lord's eyes light up, they stand a little straighter. They don't need applause or speeches, they know the work they've done. The head cook strides past, his gaze sweeping over the dishes, the glint of sauce in the firelight, the neat arrangement of platters. He nods once, and you catch the barest hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. The feast isn't over yet, but for a moment, everything feels in place. The fire crackles, the knives gleam, and the cook's tired, sweaty, a little singed at the edges keep moving. Because that's what they do. And as you watch from your corner, you think, they may never taste the peacock, never sit at the high table, never hear their names toasted in the hall. But they're the quiet architects of this feast, the unseen hands shaping the spectacle. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. The kitchen hums with a different energy now, the frantic rush of the main courses easing into the slower rhythm of cleanup. The cooks wipe down benches, scrape pots, sweep up the rushes. And yet, there's still a buzz in the air, a soft, humming sense of satisfaction, like the last glow of embers after a long, roaring fire. And in the middle of it all, you spot something quietly extraordinary, a cookbook. It's half hidden beneath a sack of flour, the edges curled, the cover smudged with grease and perhaps a splash of wine or last night's stew. It's a slim, hand-bound volume, unassuming at first glance, but you know this book holds secrets. Recipes whispered from one cook to the next, instructions that have fed 1,000 feasts across the years. You edge closer, tilting your head to read the looping script. It's a jumble of Latin and French, some abbreviations so tight they look like they were written in code. One recipe catches your eye: to prepare a peacock as if it were alive. The instructions are sparse, almost a suggestion rather than a recipe. Skin the bird with care, roast it gently, redress it in its feathers, and serve it proudly, sprinkled with fine spices and, if available, gilded with gold leaf. That's it. No precise temperatures, no timings, no measurements. Just a few lines, a glimpse of a process passed down by practice and memory. Historians still argue, were these cookbooks meant to be followed to the letter? Or were they more like prompts, ideas to inspire cooks who already knew the craft, blending written advice with oral tradition? You smile, imagining the cook flipping through these pages, pausing over the sparse lines, and thinking, yes, but I'll do it my way. You imagine the cooks leaning in, debating the finer points of a recipe: how much saffron is too much, whether the cloves should be pressed into the skin before or after roasting, how long to let the bird rest before redressing it. There's a quiet thrill to it, isn't there? The sense that you're part of an unbroken chain, stretching back through centuries of cooks who all wrestled with the same problems, The same triumphs, the same stubborn birds. And the quirks. You flip to another page to make a hedgehog from marchpane. Wait, what? Yes, it seems medieval cooks loved their illusions, hedgehogs crafted from almond paste, castles made of sugar, pies that sang when live birds were released upon cutting. It's both ridiculous and wonderful, this desire to turn food into spectacle, to make a table into a stage where the guests could and over not just flavor, but fun. You wonder, too, how much the cooks improvised, how often they glanced at a recipe, shrugged, and said, "Close enough." The instructions might say to roast a peacock gently, but what does that mean over an open fire with a spit that creaks every time it turns? How do you gild a bird with gold leaf when the kitchen's drafty and the wind keeps blowing the sheets of gold into the embers? There's a sense of shared wisdom here, passed from cook to cook, often through whispered advice rather than written words. The boy who just last week scorched a batch of almonds is now learning how to stuff a peacock's neck without tearing the skin, how to use a hot iron to sear a joint without splitting the bone. You overhear a fragment of conversation, to cooks arguing over whether to baste the next peacock with butter or clarified lard. Butter's softer, one mutters, while the other counters, lard gives it shine. They laugh a little tiredly, and you can hear the unspoken truth beneath their words. No one really knows the perfect way. There's always a little guessing, a little hoping, a little prayer whispered to St. Lawrence, patron of cooks, that this bird doesn't collapse halfway through the feast. And the books, they're more like a starting point than a rule book. You suspect the cookbooks of the time were a little like family recipes scrawled on the back of an envelope, half remembered, half improvised, handed down not because they were perfect, but because they were theirs. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the kitchen around you, the soft scrape of knives on wood, the slosh of water in a bucket, the low, tired hum of voices. And in that moment, it's easy to imagine a cook from 100 years ago standing in the same spot, brow furrowed, sleeves rolled up, flipping through a greasy page and thinking, now, how did they say to stuff that peacock again? The cookbooks don't have all the answers. They never did. But they tell you enough to get started, and the rest, that's up to the cook, his hands, his heart, his memory, and maybe a little luck from the kitchen gods. As the cooks tidy the last platters, you notice something funny. The peacock, so carefully skinned, stuffed, roasted, and ray-feathered, isn't alone in its illusionary glory. No, it's part of a larger game, one that fills the entire feast table with strange, almost theatrical creations. You drift from dish to dish, marveling at the sheer audacity of it all. Over here, a swan, its long neck curled in an elegant S shape, feathers reassembled just like the peacock's, though its beak gleams with an extra touch of silver leaf. Nearby, a pie that rattles suspiciously. Wait, is that chirping? You lean in, and yes, you're not imagining it. The story was true. They've actually baked live birds into the pie, and when the crust is cracked, a flurry of sparrows bursts out, wings fluttering wildly, feathers drifting down like soft confetti onto the table. The guests gasp, some laughing, others shrieking, one lady nearly tipping her goblet into her lap as a sparrow skims past her nose. This isn't just food, it's theater. You realize that now, fully and completely. The cooks aren't just feeding the guests, they're performing. The entire meal is a stage, and each dish is a prop in an elaborate play where surprise, delight, and just a dash of absurdity are the main ingredients. You move along the table and spot another curiosity, a roast boar, its snout fitted with a golden ring, eyes replaced by glass beads that shimmer in the candlelight, an apple clenched theatrically between its teeth. There's even a hedgehog crafted entirely out of marchpane and almond paste, treat its little spikes made from carefully pressed almonds. It's so delicate, so intricate, that you half expect it to scurry off the table. Scholars still discuss whether these illusion dishes were reserved solely for the grandest occasions, coronations, royal weddings, and the like, or whether even smaller, humbler households might attempt a single, show-stopping centerpiece for a holiday table. Was this kind of culinary pageantry a widespread medieval trend, or merely the indulgence of a few especially wealthy courts? The evidence is scattered, the records contradictory, and as is often the case, the truth probably lies somewhere in between. What's clear is that this flair for spectacle wasn't limited to birds. You overhear a cook muttering about that cursed jelly castle, a towering creation of fruit-studded gelatin that wobbled so precariously last time, it nearly collapsed in front of the guests. Another cook describes a fish molded into the shape of a sea monster, complete with pastry fins and almond sliver teeth. There's talk of pies that sing and puddings that dance, though whether those tales are fact or simply the result of a little too much wine, well, that's still up for debate. You can't help but smile, picturing the apprentices scrambling to keep a cage of sparrows from escaping too soon, or a cook frantically patching a sugar sculpture moments before the doors open. It's a kind of culinary theater, full of risk and reward, and the cooks know it well. One burned feather, one collapsed pie, one guest shrieking when a bird takes flight from their plate, that's the gamble they take. But the payoff, the wide eyes, the applause, the whispered stories that ripple out from the feast long after the candles burn low, that's what makes it worth it. And the lords and ladies, they expect to be entertained. They don't just come to dine, they come to marvel, to be surprised. Feel that little spark of delight when a dish turns out to be more than it appears. The Peacock may be the star tonight, but it's just one in a whole cast of edible wonders, each one part of the grand, fleeting performance. Back in the kitchen, the cooks are already dreaming up their next act. One gestures toward a basket of lemons, suggesting a citrus pudding shaped like a dragon. Another proposes sugar sculptures again, though last time, the sun melted the whole display before the guests even arrived. They laugh, weary but not defeated. There's a quiet pride here, a shared understanding that what they do is part art, part science, part daring spectacle. And sometimes, just sometimes, they manage to pull it off. You step back and take in the scene, the faint scent of scorched sugar, the soft clatter of knives, the last glimmers of feathers and gold catching the firelight. It's a strange world, isn't it? One where food isn't merely nourishment, it's a story, a performance, a shimmering, impossible dream brought to life for a brief, dazzling moment. And in the end, you realize, the Peacock is just the beginning. The grand hall, once alive with laughter and the clink of goblets, now exhales a long, quiet sigh as the feast winds down. The Peacock still sits at the center of the table, its feathers drooping slightly, the skin no longer glistening, the edges curling in the soft candlelight. The guests, drowsy and full, sink back into their chairs, their conversation dwindling to soft murmurs. Yet as the candles burn low and the last goblet is drained, you sense a shift. The age of the Peacock, the era of illusion dishes and gilded birds, is beginning to fade. It wasn't always this way. For centuries, the Peacock was the star of the table, a symbol of extravagance, a centerpiece for kings and nobles alike. But times are changing. You overhear two older lords grumbling by the hearth. It's all well and good, but I'd rather have a proper capon, less fuss, more meat. One waves a hand toward the Peacock, now more decoration than dish. The other nods, swirling the dregs of his wine, and mutters that the last feast at the neighboring manor had no peacock at all, and still quite respectable. You glance toward the kitchen, where the cooks are quietly gathering their tools, stacking empty platters, sweeping crumbs from the rushes. Their movements are slower now, no longer frantic, but steady, deliberate, as if they, too, can feel the tide turning. Historians still debate why exactly the fashion for peacock dining declined. Some suggest it was the rise of simpler, heartier dishes, roasts that fed more people with fewer complications, fewer mishaps, and no chance of feathers ending up in someone's goblet. Others argue it was simply a matter of taste. If the meat wasn't worth the trouble, why keep up the charade? And still others believe it was the inevitable shift of time itself. Trade routes expanded, new ingredients arrived from distant shores: chocolate, coffee, potatoes. Why fuss over a bird that was more show than sustenance when you could impress your guests with exotic fruits or spices from the New World? And yet, even as the trend faded, the peacock lingered in the imagination. You can see it in the tapestries, woven into the borders of grand scenes. You hear it in the poetry, where a proud man might still be called peacock-like in his vanity. You spot it in the marginalia of a crumbling manuscript, a tiny peacock doodled in the corner, its tail fanned wide, a little joke by a bored scribe. The bird became less a dish and more a symbol, a reminder of an age when dinner was theater and every course was a spectacle. But the cooks, they adapt. They always do. You catch a few of them talking in low voices. One mentions that the Lord is fond of roasted beef these days, with a gravy made from ale and herbs. Another suggests they should experiment with a new pudding recipe that uses sugar imported from Venice. You see it in their faces, a quiet resilience, a willingness to move on, to keep creating, even as tastes change and fashions shift. One cook, a weary man with a crooked grin, flicks a feather off his sleeve and mutters, "Let the peacocks go. We'll find something else to dazzle them." His words hang in the air, half a joke, half a prophecy. You think of the peacock, its shimmering feathers, its odd, slightly gamey meat, its role as both dinner and decor, and you realize it was always a little bit of a dream, culinary sleight of hand. A momentary illusion. And like all dreams, it has to end sometime. The guests rise, stretching, murmuring their thanks to the host. A few glance at the peacock, but most don't spare it a second thought. It's just a bird now, cold, sagging slightly, no longer magical. And as the lords and ladies drift away, the cooks begin clearing the table, wiping the platters, stacking the knives. Tomorrow, there will be another meal. The kitchen fires will crackle back to life, and the cooks will find new ways to impress, to satisfy, to surprise. But the peacock, its time in the spotlight is slipping into memory, a relic of a fading world. And you watch it all, a quiet observer in the flickering candlelight. And you wonder, what will they think of us, centuries from now, when they look back on our tables, our feasts, our fads? Will they laugh at our avocado toast, our edible gold flakes, our unicorn-shaped desserts? Probably, just as we smile now at a roasted peacock in full feathered regalia, gleaming under the smoky light of a long-ago feast. The hall has mostly emptied now, the echoes of laughter fading into the darkened corners. Servants move quietly through the room, snuffing candles, sweeping away the last crumbs. The peacock, once the star of the show, sits forlornly on its platter, the shimmer of its feathers dulled by time and smoke. It almost looks sad, doesn't it? As if the bird itself knows that its glory days are slipping away. And yet, as you linger in the quiet, a strange thought floats up. Maybe the peacock was never just about the feast. You've seen how the bird has lingered, not just in kitchens and on tables, but in the stories people tell. You've heard the murmurs from the guests as they leave, half-whispered tales of how the peacock's flesh never decayed, how its feathers could ward off evil spirits, how a feather tucked beneath your pillow might bring vivid dreams or even protect you from the evil eye. It's a strange patchwork of beliefs, isn't it? Historians still debate whether these superstitions were widespread or just the odd habits of a few eccentric households. Some say the peacock's tail, with its many eyes, was seen as a symbol of watchfulness, an omen of protection. Others believed it to be a sign of vanity, of pride gone too far, a reminder that beauty fades, and so does favor. You catch a snippet of a story from one of the kitchen maids, who leans in close to another as they scrub down the long table. They say the king's mistress once wore a peacock feather in her hair. And when she fell from grace, it was the feather that did it. Bad luck, it was. They shiver, half laughing, half believing, and move on to polishing goblets. Another servant recounts in a half-sung rhyme that placing a peacock feather in your home invites jealousy and discord, while someone else counters that a feather above the door will keep sickness away. Which is it? Hard to say. Belief is slippery like that. And yet, despite all the warnings and whispers, the peacock remains a symbol of beauty, of splendor. You remember the tapestries, those grand, intricate scenes where the bird stands proudly among kings and saints, its tail fanned in glorious color. You think of the illuminated manuscripts, where monks, hunched over their vellum, couldn't resist adding a little peacock in the margins, just for the joy of it. There's even a legend, you recall, of a peacock feather being carried into battle by a knight, a charm against misfortune. It's funny, isn't it, how a bird can hold so many meanings: pride and protection, beauty and vanity, good luck and bad, all at once. And in a way, isn't that exactly what the cooks have been doing all along? Weaving meaning into their meals, crafting stories from roasted birds and gilded pies, creating feasts that are as much about symbolism as sustenance. The cooks know the stories, of course. They've heard them all, half in jest, half in warning. They joke about peacock curses when the feathers catch fire, or when the meat comes out stringy, or when the guests turn up their noses at the bird they've labored over for hours. But they also know the thrill of serving something that makes people sit up and take notice, that spark of joy when a guest leans in, wide-eyed, and whispers, "Look at that." And so the peacock lives on, in a way, not just as a dish on a platter, but as a symbol that flits through the stories we tell, the art we create, the little beliefs we carry in the quiet corners of our minds. You glance back at the kitchen one last time, where the cooks are packing away the feathers with a care that feels almost reverent. They'll be used again, most likely not for tonight's guests, but for the next feast, the next performance. Because even as the fashion for peacock dining fades, the lure of the bird itself remains, shimmering at the edge of memory, a quiet echo of a world where beauty, spectacle, and superstition all came together in a single, improbable dish. And as you turn away, the flicker of a candle catches on a stray feather resting on the floor, its colors still vivid despite the chaos of the night. It glows softly, like a little flame in the dark, waiting for the next story, the next table, the next feast. The hall is quiet now. The guests have gone, their laughter trailing away like smoke into the night, their footprints left in the soft, trampled rushes. The candles have burned low, their wax pooling in little golden puddles, and the last of the wine sits in goblets, half finished, forgotten. The peacock, once the shimmering star of the feast, now lies still, its feathers a little ruffled, its eyes glassy, its skin cooling in the flickering light. It has served its purpose, admired, whispered about, perhaps even envied. Now, it rests. You linger in the hush, watching the kitchen staff begin their slow, methodical work of cleaning up. The cooks move with a different rhythm now, the frantic energy of the feast replaced by a slower, steadier pace. They stack plates, scrape trenchers into buckets, wipe down the long, scarred wooden tables. The fire still crackles in the hearth, casting long, soft shadows on the stone walls. You can almost feel the relief in the air, like a long-held breath finally released. The apprentices trade quiet jokes as they scrub pots. Someone hums a tune under their breath, the melody lilting gently over the clatter of dishware. There's an easy camaraderie here, a shared sense of survival. They've made it through another feast, and no one lost an eyebrow to the fire this time. You glance back at the peacock, its feathers catching the last glow of the fire. For a moment, it almost seems to shimmer again, just a flicker of light on green and blue, a memory of its earlier grandeur. And you realize, the peacock isn't just a dish. It's a story, a symbol, a fleeting moment of beauty and absurdity in a world that's often harsh and practical. Historians still argue whether medieval diners truly appreciated the taste of peacock or whether it was all for the spectacle. But maybe that's missing the point. Maybe the magic wasn't in the flavor at all, but in the act of creating something so elaborate, so improbable, that it felt like a little slice of wonder served up on a platter. The cooks know this, in their bones. That's why they labor over every detail, why they risk singed fingers and midnight hours. It's not just about feeding bellies, it's about feeding the imagination, sparking a little on a world that often leaves little room for such things. You stand quietly as the last platters are carried away. The fire dims, and the cooks begin to drift toward their pallets, yawning and stretching, ready for what little rest they can snatch before the next day begins. The kitchen settles into a hush, a soft, warm quiet, like a lullaby made of crackling embers and the faint rustle of feathers. You take one last look at the peacock, lying there like a dream that's just beginning to fade, and you think, maybe it wasn't meant to last. Maybe it was always about the fleeting moment, the gasp of surprise, the shimmer in the candlelight. And as you turn to leave, you carry that image with you, the bird, the feast, the laughter, the quiet after. A memory of a time when food was more than sustenance, it was theater, art, and a story worth telling. And now, as the kitchen settles into silence and the last embers glow softly in the hearth, it's time to let the story drift away, like the gentle flicker of a candle in the dark. You breathe in deeply, feeling the softness of the moment, the slow, steady hum of a world winding down after a long, bustling night. The cooks, weary but satisfied, sleep soundly on straw pallets, the kitchen quiet except for the occasional creak of wood settling, the faint sigh of the wind slipping through the eaves. The peacock rests too, its feathers still catching a hint of gold in the dim light, a final shimmer before the dark. Outside, the moon glides across the sky, silver and soft, casting a pale glow over the rooftops and the quiet fields beyond. The world is still, and you feel the hush settle into your bones, a reminder that every feast, no matter how grand, must eventually give way to the simple peace of the night. You close your eyes and picture it all once more, the laughter, the rustle of silk, the scent of roasted spices, the quiet pride in the cook's eyes. The peacock shimmering on the table like a creature from a dream. And as that dream fades, you drift deeper into the warmth of sleep, safe, still, and steady, knowing that stories like this strange, beautiful, fleeting are always there, waiting. Just beyond the next door, the next table, the next softly glowing hearth. Good night, my friend, sleep well, and dream of feathers and firelight. Good night and sweet dreams.